Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this webinar from the Australian Water School and from ISWAL and the University of Adelaide. Our webinar today is about good water governance to enhance future security, and our presenter is Dr. Adam Locke from the University of Adelaide. I'm Ian Reid. I'm the Chief Academic Officer here at ISWAL, and a great pleasure to welcome you all here to our webinar. Here's the registrations we've had today. As you can see from a broad range of countries, many from Australia and from many other countries as well. Good to have you all with us. Before we start, just a little notice about some upcoming professional development webinars and courses. You can see there are a range of courses we've got both online and face-to-face. We're happy to hear of your interest in those or any other topics, so please let us know. Our agenda today is a 20-minute presentation from Adam, and then 20 minutes allocated for question and answers. You'll, again, really encouraged to ask those questions. You'll be emailed a link to the recording of the webinar straight afterwards, and also as soon as the webinar is finished, you'll have a small survey pop up and you'll be asked some feedback. Please complete the survey. We really value your input so that we can improve these webinars in the future. So today's presenter is Dr. Adam Locke from the University of Adelaide. He's a senior lecturer and ARC DECRA fellow, and he works in the Centre for Global Food and Resources at the University of Adelaide here in South Australia. Lots of experience and lots of really good information to share with us on this topic. So Adam, without further ado, over to you. Thank you.
Too good. Thanks, Ian. And my sincere thanks to ISWARM for making this opportunity available to me. And of course, sincere thanks to all of you for joining us today. What I'm going to do is I'm going to effectively try and summarize what is definitely a very complicated topic around good governance and increased future water security. It's not going to be a crash course by any means. There's a lot of stuff going on in this topic, but I'll try and give you an inkling for it, the complexities of it, some of the importance of it, and also a little pitch for the course that we've started last year in this area if you're interested. So effectively, there we go. Start by thinking about what water security is, and it's safe to say that it's obviously not a particularly simple thing to get your head around. There's been a range of different definitions over the years. One that I've listed there from 2007, where we were thinking about the ideas of clean water to maintain standards of food, goods production, sanitation, sustainable health. A more recent one, 2013 from UN Water, which has really upped the ante in the space for water security, not only thinking about food and production and sustainable health, etc., and proper sanitation, but bringing in very clear ideas about well-being, socioeconomic development, waterborne pollution, water-related disasters, which of course for many contexts is very important, and preserving ecosystems. And that for us here in Australia has been a big issue. And you can see it sort of summarized on the right there. And importantly, within those sort of central goals within the circle, you'll note the ideas that are critical to supporting those outcomes for transboundary cooperation, adequate financing, peace and political stability, which for some of us is always a bit of a critical issue and a difficult thing. But right up the top left there, this idea of good governance. So the legal regimes, the institutions, organizations, the infrastructure, of course, when we're talking about water, and the capacity to deliver water, to manage it effectively, all of these things critical for essentially bringing these goals together and being successful in achieving them. It is by no means a simple thing, but it is a very important thing. Most of you joining today, I think, would appreciate this. In the last 3 years, water crises have been noted the #1 societal risk for our planet, looking forward over the next 18 months and in fact over the next 10 years by the World Economic Forum. It was sitting down around the 3rd or 4th spot from memory for a little while back around 2013, 2014, but it's jumped to #1 for obvious reasons and remains obviously a critical focus for governments around the world. The other thing is the Sustainable Development Goals that the United Nations have put in place. Again, most of you would be familiar. But when you think about these, water is clearly integral to so many. If we think about poverty, hunger, good health, we think about clean water and sanitation, jobs and economic growth, infrastructure, sustainable cities, responsible consumption, life below the water, life on the land, peace and justice. Water is tied up with all of those, and there's probably an argument for the others to be involved as well. So good governance in this area is critical for all of us going forward into the future. The things that I think are important to realize or to recognize are then what causes us to have poor water security generally. And there's a number of these that we could talk about, but a few of them that we tend to focus on are this idea of increased competition. So population increases, which is prevalent, as we know, around the world, and an ongoing issue. The change to income, the growing middle class, which is driving the consumption of goods, more access to income, which is driving more consumption, etc. And essentially competition between different sectors. So where irrigation has been for years and years and years one of the largest users of fresh water for agriculture to provide us with food security, increasingly things like the environment, recreation, indigenous requirements, all of these things are coming into the fore more and more as we move forward, which is putting pressure on them to either reallocate or release some of the water that they've used in the past, while they themselves as a sector are obviously growing to meet our food needs as well. There are, I think, most of us would agree, limited further supply options for future growth. We can build dams and weirs, we can impound, as they say, water in a variety of areas, but economically, most of the economic dams, if you like, have been sourced and built. Environmentally, we now struggle, of course, to come up with justification for impounding water and causing problems for the movement of fish and other things downstream. Essentially, yes, the chances for us to grow our total supply are very limited. And efficiency, whilst promising, comes with its own problems. It's not a bad thing, efficiency, quite a good thing, in fact. But ironically, as we've noted for quite a long time, efficiency can often lead, paradoxically, to increased competition. So it's one that doesn't necessarily work as well as we'd hope. It's certainly not, in my view, a panacea. There's poor or non-existent property rights. By that, I mean that the legal definitions for water, you'll remember I talked about the institutions for governments, the legal arrangements. There is, of course, the underlying idea that water is a fundamental human right. Whilst that is a nice idea, it's not necessarily a practical idea. And property rights can help us to alleviate some of those things, but where the institutions aren't strong enough in our government, where we have legal failings, where we have enforcement failings, then our property rights may not be up to the job, and so that allows us to have less options for good governance. And all of that suggests that then we're then limited in our ability to effectively reallocate water, and particularly during scarcity events. Flooding is something that obviously is at the other end of the spectrum, which needs to be managed a little bit differently. But when we here in Australia in particular enter into periods of drought, these are increasingly prolonged in some respects. They are increasing in their severity, and they create very big problems for our economy, for our livestock, for our environment, etc., for our domestic population as well. So when that happens, good governance, if it's in place, and arguably in Australia, I think during the last extended drought, the Millennium Drought from about 2001 to 2010, was managed as well as it could be, and I think effectively in relative terms because of our investment many years previously to that in markets, etc. And then finally, climate change impacts. These are having a dramatic already impact, as I say before, on the inflows to our existing storages. They are, as I say, creating some concern around drought and floods and extreme events, which we then have to manage and to contend with and be resilient to. An example here from Western Australia, the Denmark Dam. This one is often used. It's because I guess it's a stark example of what can happen. You'll note for about 40 years, roughly, they had a very reliable inflow of about 30 gigalitres into the dam. And then literally almost overnight, the trend shows a small downward drop. But effectively, in 2001, the dam halved in terms of its inflows, and that seems to have been maintained to this point. In fact, there's an extension to this graph where, as you can see, the little downward trend in 2015, I think there's been another step change that they've predicted in the inflows beyond this period shown here. That roughly 50% drop in inflows has had a massive impact, negative impact on the water availability as a result essentially of climate change and the drop in water coming into that system. And they've had to contend with that now for quite some time. So poor water governance, if we don't get this right, it's got big impacts for employment, obviously international investment and trade, domestic investment as well, our food production, water security, our quality of supply. In Australia, we've had big issues in the past with salinity. We still do. We manage it, I think, relatively effectively, but that's a big issue for us. And as I say, environmental uses more and more recognized by scientists and others as fundamental to the sustainable nature of our water resources globally. These are a little bit busy. I apologize for these slides. I'll really highlight some of the key words. Water from a governance perspective is unique. It's not something that is easily done, and it contends with a range of very important and critical things. It's a freshwater renewable resource. Groundwater might be a little bit different, but essentially it's something that is essential for society's survival, our economic development, health. There is, of course, very little in the way of substitute for water, and it's highly mobile. It generally knows no boundaries. It's a cross-cutting resource. Groundwater and surface water interact, return flows, extractions, etc., consumption versus abstractions. All of these things mean that somebody's excess water is, of course, the allocation for the next person downstream. And so the watershed as a planning unit is critical for environmental and economic support. The other thing is, of course, that from a governance perspective, a lot of you would recognize and appreciate the cost. I said before that it's a basic, it's considered by many as a basic human right. The problem with water is that it is heavy, it's bulky, it is probably necessary to deliver it more or less from a close proximity. It requires capital intensive infrastructure, large storages built to overcome the issues associated with delivering and pumping and move. So there's an enormous cost involved in water and moving it around, which has to be taken into account. We can do that by effectively pricing water, and that I say that not a little bit tongue-in-cheek, but conscious of the fact that that's a lot easier said than done, as we discovered in a workshop last year. Pricing water where you have a market is relatively straightforward, but otherwise it can be tricky. And I'd like to make the point here that pricing of water is very different from the idea of charges for water, which may be associated with returning some of the revenue required to maintain this capital intensive nature of water. Whereas pricing, particularly to include scarcity values when water is in a drought, can be quite challenging and has been for many. So clearly there's a lot of potential for conflict in water, growing potential for conflict. And already there are a range of areas around the world which are struggling with water as either the idea of physical water scarcity, like ourselves here in the Murray-Darling Basin in Australia. Well, I'm just outside the basin. Western US, most of the Northern African nations, and obviously through central China. There's the concept of economic water scarcity, where essentially there may be abundant supply, but we haven't had the infrastructure put in place to get that to the people who could benefit from it or use it, including the environment. You'll see there most of Central Africa, parts of northern India. And then those contexts which are, if they're not already, they're approaching physical water scarcity, where essentially 60% of the river flows have been allocated. And obviously they are really getting to the point where a closed basin arrangement will need to be investigated as a priority to ensure that they don't go down some of the over-allocation paths that many of us, including us here in Australia, have had to contend with over the last few decades. I mentioned earlier that the idea then is we need to essentially learn how to share our water better. The needs for this around drought, flooding, sanitation, inadequate supply, our ecological degradation, but importantly, this idea, I think, that most of us are becoming more familiar with, this idea of future uncertainty, reduced quality, climate change impacts, population increases, and aging infrastructure has been on the mind, I know, of people who deal with it for a long time. It's becoming more, I think, widespread, known and appreciated that a lot of the infrastructure we take for granted to secure and deliver our water is now reaching, in many parts of the world, it's engineering life. And so we're going to have to figure out how we govern that situation in future as well. But you'll note from the graph on the right that if we're thinking about sharing it, where is it perhaps expected to be gotten from, if you like, and where is it expected to go? Well, you'll note there that the source of this water is likely to be irrigation for the most part. That sector typically is using 70, 80, as much as perhaps 90% of available freshwater resources. And so it's arguable that they have the scope for reallocation, but of course that comes at a cost across the board. If we then think about this idea of reallocating and shifting things around, the big question is, well, who's involved in that process? So this chart gives you a very rough and clearly by no means exhaustive idea of who may be involved at the different contexts, global through to local or individual, and political across to environmental, and the sort of role that they play. So you can see that organizations like the World Bank, the Nature Conservancy, the UN, obviously, which discussed, World Health Organization, Water Resources Institute, FAO, Gates, and the transboundary organizations, including the Murray-Darling Basin Authority here in Australia, play a critical role across the political, economic, social, and environmental spectrums of governance in terms of setting the scene, providing those institutions, providing the legislative requirements, etc., and the backing and indeed the financing from time to time to get these things right. These are supported by, say, the G8 summits, which again bring our focus on these issues from time to time very usefully, and social and environmental, the role that NGOs, government health agencies, World Wildlife Fund, Nature Conservancy, Friends of Earth, play in, again, focusing our attention on the need for good governance, on the issues stemming from poor water security or poor governance, extremely important. Down at the national level, obviously, politically, we have our own governments to contend with, and their role is critical. Increasingly here in Australia, we're seeing also at both national and in one case a state level, the role that an environmental water holder is playing to deliver part of the environmental objectives here increasingly. We have transnational corporations that I think also are growing, particularly obviously in the urban areas, and they provide a very useful and important role for economic signals, particularly again around pricing, but also infrastructure, and that comes with a range of issues down the track. And then finally, of course, our own individual and local institutions and the role that they play, catchment management authorities, indeed small or large environmental groups within local regions, and our individuals ourselves, what we can do to be part of the process of good water governance. Because effectively, good water governance does require cooperation, and this, unfortunately, is where it also, more of them regularly, comes unstuck. We go through a couple of different types of cooperation. We can cooperate to try and get increased benefits to the river. We can cooperate to get increased benefits from the river. We can cooperate to reduce the costs because of the river, and that's arguably where we're at here in Australia. We've moved essentially to, well, we're trying to avoid tense regional relations and political economy impacts. We're shifting to a focus on cooperation and development, shifting also from food and energy self-sufficiency in a sense to security at a national welfare level to reduce the conflict. Arguably, there are enormous benefits that have come out of that process. There are some backward steps that occur from time to time. But ultimately, what we have really achieved here in particular is the increasing benefits beyond the river from, I believe, the integration of regional infrastructure and through our investments over many, many, many years, our ability to market and trade water at the margin to effectively deal economically with some of these scarcity issues as they occur. And so once again, back to this idea of bringing all of that together, this cooperation, you can see it involves all parties acting together. And when any one of those parties begins to obfuscate, if they begin to, as we would say in economics, rent seek or act with strategic behavior, in other words, in their own self-interest, then we really do threaten this process and its ability to be achieved. So coming then towards the end, what we think in this course of ours is essentially that there's probably five solutions that we can put to think about, to address good governance, to achieve good governance of water security. The first is projects. We've talked about that as a fairly limited strategy. The supply augmentation or the building of dams and weirs is, as we said, fairly limited for future. We can move into increasingly demand management strategies. We can go into preachments, which is the same as education. We can try and make people more aware of the cost of water, the value of water, the scarcity of water, both within periods of extreme climate or just normal supply areas. We can try to make them change their ways and alter their behavior, which, as most of us would know, is not easy. We can try and increase our policing or our compliance and enforcement, and this is a critical part of good water governance. There is an example here, I hate to say, where we've had some compliance issues in Australia that have been very difficult to ignore, for sure, and ultimately have created some concerns about our governance arrangements, whether they're working, people threatening to stop cooperating, to walk away from years and years of the arrangements that have been invested in and put in place. And that's deeply disturbing. And the reason for that is because effectively the compliance, the policing, arguably was not done effectively and people were doing the wrong thing. It has large consequences, and so governance is a high-stakes game when water is concerned because, as my father used to say when we were irrigating, farmer next door will probably give you their wife before they'll give you a cup of water. It's for fighting over, as they say. So the final ones, economic strategies, pricing, which we've discussed, which is again different from charges, but not an easy thing to put in place short of effective markets. And then finally, the property rights, which when, again, properly defined and put in place can be very, very useful for allowing reallocation at the margin during scarcity or other times to take place, which can grow economic value, it can grow environmental benefits, as we've seen here, as long as, again, it's policed appropriately. It can grow the national welfare so that everybody effectively is better off from what remains a scarce and finite supply of water resource. So the shameless plug. This, if it's piqued your interest, we do, of course, get into a lot more detail on those 5 Ps. We get into a lot more detail about these issues in general. Difficult, as I say, to do justice to it in 15 or 20 minutes. I hope that I have at least provided some interest in this issue and some ideas for you to take away. But if you're interested, we do run a course at the university over a couple of weeks. It's a flexible delivery, which provides, in my view, excellent insight, good contacts, practical presentations by people in the field, and of course, some additional knowledge in this area if you're interested. So thank you. Really appreciate your time joining us today. And as Ian said, happy to now take any questions from you.
Thanks, Adam. That's been terrific. We've had a number of questions come through. I think you have piqued quite a number of people's interests. Looking through some of the questions we've had so far, there's been a couple of people who've asked about, I guess, the role of politics and how that helps or hinders. So Liz has asked, says that should the politicisation of water issues be considered as a problem, or is it good for water governance? And also, Sylvia Santapato says, how can we understand if a government and or institution is reacting properly to the challenge posed by water security? So if you're in government, what sort of role do you think this should take in terms of water governance?
Well, obviously, the politics is a critical issue. If we think back, for both good and bad, if we think back to the Australian situation, there's plenty of good examples where effectively there's been what we might call knee-jerk reactions to water requirements. And so the politics can come into play where it can speed up good outcomes. We can really see the issues get some airtime. We can see them get some funding. We can see them get the legislative requirements. And indeed, if we think back to John Howard's moves around the National Plan for Water Security, which came 2006, 2007 here on the back of, well, I think we were just starting to realize the Millennium Drought and its effects. It went on, of course, for 3 or 4 years. So that was timely and political. But the plan arguably was not perhaps thought through very well. It was, 10 or 12 points jotted on a piece of paper. So politically, wonderful, but implemented, could have been better. And we, of course, still pay some of the prices for that. The alternative is, yes, where you don't see good, firm political support for water reform, water governance, the importance of compliance, for example. And so, yes, if you're not getting good political signals from those people who are in charge, who are setting the scene, setting the standard for the people who, let's face it, just work for them. Public servants do as they're asked. And we've got, like everywhere, I think we've got fantastic public servants in this country who do, within the confines of the political realities, what they can to get it right. So no, politics, obviously crucial. But it's a hard one to, coming to Sylvia's question, it's a hard one to measure. Yes, I've struggled with this idea in a research sense for a long time. How do you get at incorporating politics into a study, for example? How do you get it measured and assessed and evaluated when it is so furtive? It's a tricky one. I haven't got the answer to that.
Yeah, no, it's not straightforward, but worth further investigation. Can I just maybe continue that a little bit further? Paul's got a question. He's an irrigator, and he said that he's seen the politics and media governed by city dwellers who are actually high pro rata consumers of water per person, maybe not per plant, and their community consumption. And you notice in some of your graphs that future demand may have to come from irrigation. So how are we going to balance that rural versus urban divide?
Yeah, it's another good point. I think that the one thing I'd like to point out here that I think we did really well, not necessarily, well, we haven't continued it. That's my issue, is we've let buyback go, or we've effectively constrained it. I think that's the wrong approach. I know that's been discussed a lot here in Australia. The reason I say that is that buyback is an effective tool because nobody holds a gun to anyone's head. So if an irrigator, who's typically the person who's targeted, let's say, in the invitation to participate, decides to participate, then that can be a very good outcome for them, and then a very good outcome for, let's say, urban communities and metropolitan communities in particular. And I know Paul will probably be thinking, yet rural communities are very different, and he's absolutely right. So I'll come back to that. But remember, buyback also was targeted at the environment. So I think we've lost a bit of sight about that. It wasn't necessarily targeted at gaining water for urban communities. However, that aside, again, yes, it's a tricky one to manage, this idea of making people in the cities understand the stakes, which I think is important, understand the costs. And again, it's that idea of preachments. So as a former irrigator, full disclosure, yeah, I wholeheartedly agree. The people who are out there irrigating are usually doing a dash good job. They're reasonably efficient, or as efficient as they can be. They understand the value of a drop of water and they use it accordingly. So it's an idea of learning in some respects from them, but equally, we still, at the end of the day, are going to have to be moving this stuff around. So I like the idea of buybacks, because if the urban water supplies are using water at a higher ratio, technically they should value it at a higher level, and they should be willing to pay for it accordingly. And I think if water users in the cities are saying, no, we need more water, we need, et cetera, then they also, as an economist, I believe, must be willing to pay for it.
Yes, thank you. Look, questions are rolling in thick and fast, so I'll have to ask you, Adam, to be a bit briefer with your answers. So sorry about that.
Sorry. Yep.
There's a few more now on more of the mechanics of how to do this. Coach Kumar talks about the importance of water accounting. Perhaps a brief comment on that.
Ooh, that's a very good point. Yeah, it's in a sense it's critical. In my view, there is no greater need to get water governance right than to have good information. And typically that's what we don't have. So water accounting plays a huge role in that. Pardon me. Also, yes, understanding what is extracted, where's it going, who's using it, what then is being returned to the system. All of these things are critical. And that is part of the reason why efficiency, I think, is struggling here to actually live up to its expectations, because efficiency is a great thing. Don't get me wrong. I love efficiency. It's a brilliant idea. But ultimately, if you don't know what was being lost, then how can you account for the efficiency savings? And so ultimately, yeah, water accounting plays a critical role.
Can I perhaps get a bit more controversial now too? Liz has said, we've been told that markets are a great way to be more efficient. But then on one of your earlier slides, you also said that it's competition is actually a threat to water security. So how do those two come together?
Well, I think competition becomes a threat because effectively it's taking a scarce resource, a finite resource, and at the margin, it's increasing people's reliance on it. So competition between sectors, as Paul was saying, say between rural and urban use, is a big driver. Population growth, people moving to cities. Oh, I never did get a chance to come back to the rural communities, did I? Sorry.
That's okay.
But yes, that's a concern, obviously, for rural communities. But markets, they're not a panacea either. Markets are incredibly expensive to put in place. They're incredibly difficult to put in place. We've spent 30 years trying to get them right in this country. And now they're working, and it took a drought of unbelievable, unprecedented in modern history proportions for us to appreciate the value of it. So there's competition within a market that drives a recognition of the value of water, and then its price and its movement. And then there's competition within sectors, which is a question of, well, what do you use as the tool to address that competition between sectors, which could be markets, could be pricing, could be payment for ecosystem services, could be a range of different things. Sure. Markets, to my mind, if you think of a sort of a pyramid of institutions, markets would be the absolute top.
I'll just interrupt there. Then, Matt, there's got a few other questions too about price, the difference between pricing and charging you mentioned, and also Emma has asked a question that says that scarcity values are often omitted from pricing. Is there much movement to incorporating those?
Well, I think, okay, so coming back to the first part, if we think of the market that I was talking about before, so we have somebody who's demanding water, somebody who's supplying water. where effectively the price is met and agreed to. Somebody will sell the water to the person who's demanding it. That's a simple price example. And so that may, for example, be $50 a megalitre in relatively normal conditions here, which may sound a lot, but is actually quite cheap. So it's $50 for an Olympic-sized swimming pool's worth of water. I don't want to make that sound flippant by any means, but in the scheme of things, you would say that's not terribly expensive. Now, in scarcity terms, that can go up to an enormous amount, 10, 20 times that value, which in a farming situation is a very, very real problem, because their margins are not going to sustain that, depending on the crops, etc. If we think about charges are aimed at recovering the costs of delivering that water. So they're very different to the price. So they may simply be there to effectively recoup what it costs to have the pipes, to maintain them, and even potentially, or ideally, refurbish them over time as that infrastructure ages and gets old. So that's the distinction between those. Sorry, Ian, what was the second part? I forgot.
Look, just about the inclusion of scarcity.
Scarcity, yes. So scarcity is a tricky thing to incorporate into the price of water, this kind of equilibrium in the market, as we say, because scarcity may have impacts for other users in the drought. The environment may suffer, recreational users may suffer, indigenous users the world over are very rarely included in these ideas and can't. So the idea is that they are in some respects excluded from the markets. And so when scarcity comes about, they also have an impact. Sorry, they're also impacted by that, but may not have as much ability to get into the market where the prices are set, and therefore their value, their impact are not captured by the price in the market.
Right, great, thanks. I might get over to a broader issue now. Peter from MDBA actually asked that in the Australian context, independence and science have been included in the governance of water management. In your opinion, has this been effective, and are these important to good governance, the inclusion of science?
Oh, yes, critical. And I think this brings me to a point which has been on our mind as a group of water economists here for some time, and actually we've been talking about it for recent weeks, and I don't want to steal anyone's thunder, but there has been great science, and one example of that was the guide. Anyone who had read the guide to the Murray-Darling Basin Plan and the technical reports could not but be amazed and in awe of the work that was done in support of that. Now, personally, I loved it. It just wasn't communicated properly. I'm not saying that the objectives at the high 7,500 gig recovery target, I mean, that was just mooted as a possibility. It was never being taken seriously. But it got burned on the banks of the Murrumbidgee, and that was the end of that. The science behind that is critical, and we had a lot of great science going into that. Now, if we think about, let's fast forward 7 years to the socioeconomic studies that are taking place. These are the social science inputs for the changes and reductions now to the SDL, the sustainable diversion limit, or if you like, the cap on extractions that's providing us with our sustainable target and base for ecological issues here. Frankly, it's crap. I've seen some terrible studies. We've been witness to some terrible studies in this country, which are being touted as gospel, that that communities are effectively being hurt by this basin plan. And if you begin to tear the thing apart on any measure, they just don't stand up to scrutiny. So there's science and there's science. And I think we've had equal measure fantastic, wonderful, enormously valuable science, and we'd have equal measure terrible science that we've called into use in governance when it's suited us. And that's
great.
Yeah.
Terrific. Thank you for that. Our time is running away fast, and we've got a lot of questions here still. So I apologise to those who I haven't got to yet. I'll do my best, but we may not get to you all. Perhaps the next area is probably the issue about. There's a few questions here from a number of people, including Pradeep, about the role of recycling and whether that's a strong assistance to these governance ideas.
It is, I think, yes. I mean, at the urban level, that it comes into the efficiency issue, of course, but yes, it has an enormous role to play. Typically what happens, and it happened here, is that when you go to sell it to the typical domestic consumer, they run a mile because nobody wants to drink what was toilet water. Of course, if that's what we're talking about, of course, we're drinking it every day. So effectively, yes, recycling, I think, has got to play a bigger part in what we're doing. But I think there's an interesting, I didn't put it up, but there's an interesting graph that came out of a thesis many years ago that showed the gap between where our demand is headed and where our technological improvements can meet that. And there's, from memory, there's a 60% gap between what our technological gains can provide and what our future supply is looking like. So recycling is important, but ultimately technology is not going to it's not going to close the void.
Okay. Look, I'm going to go back to a specific question about one of your slides. So if you're able to remind yourself about slide, Yuriana asked why Australia didn't choose the Type 4 approach in your slide 25. Why? What are the challenges and constraints for that type to be implemented?
Well, no, I might have, I apologize, I might have misled you there. In fact, I highlighted the third slide because I think that's probably where most people tend to end up. Australia is actually in the Type 4. So because of our implementation of markets, because the fact that we've gone down that path now for many decades has meant that we've been able, well, here in the Murray-Darling Basin anyway, we've been able to rely on a more integrated movement of water across different watersheds. And we've been able to rely on the market as a means of efficiently and effectively reallocating water between users who can get access to the market. And that's increasing day by day. So, no, I think, yes, I apologize. No, we're actually using Type 4. Yeah. Yeah.
Good. Now, Anne Jensen asked a question. She says, do your solutions include reducing demand through increasing efficiency of water use or of changing crops even, and also reducing historical over-allocation of water resources to a consumptive use, the change of use? It's not obvious where those things fit in your headings. So can you explain that?
No, good question. And yeah, again, I apologize if there's any confusion there or if it wasn't clear. So reducing demand through increasing efficiency, I think, like I say, that's a tricky one because when we seek to increase efficiency, we can paradoxically increase consumption. And the reason for that, very simply, is because with efficiency, costs go down. The cost of accessing water decreases with the technological change. And that actually makes us think, well, it's cheaper to use it, so I'll use more. It's paraphrasing, but that's one way. So efficiency is not necessarily a panacea either. I think that, sorry, I've lost Anne's question. I had it there.
Sorry, it was in the answer. I'll put it in the answered column. There,
Gotcha. Sorry.
Sorry.
So effectively, a lot of governments are sold on the idea of efficiency. And as I say, it's not a bad idea as long as water accounting underpins it and we understand and can prove that what we have saved is real. And I think that's what we're struggling with here in Australia, for example. We haven't necessarily been able to do that. And so is it a demand management function? Yes and no. Like I say, it's a complicated one, but the idea of efficiency appeals politically, coming back to those original questions where politics is important. Politicians can sell efficiency. I can sell efficiency. Everybody can believe in it. It's a simple thing. It's not, but it's not. It's not a simple thing. And getting a lot of people to understand that is challenging in itself.
Right.
There was a second part though.
Yes, I think just about crop changes and so
on. Yeah. Oh, thank you. Yes. And so the other thing I think then is important is when we subsidize efficiency, as we're doing here and elsewhere, we typically have a tendency to do that, then we can really promote crop changes. And I was in the Riverland on the weekend here, for those of you who don't know, is in the south of the Murray-Darling Basin. And I was amazed at the amount of almonds that are either going in
huge
already in. It's incredible. Now, I don't know where that water's coming from. Has efficiency as a subsidized benefit to farmers driven that change, that crop change? I don't know. I
I
suspect
think it's largely because the price of almonds is so high that farmers can buy water at a high price and still make a very healthy profit. So,
absolutely,
so it's moving
absolutely.
to a high value crop. Yeah.
Absolutely. Until, of course, we flood that said market with almonds, in which case they all crash overnight. Or, problematically, we might even have a drought in this country in future, believe it or not, which then will bring the water supply for those perennial crops that need it in every single state of nature, every single year to stay alive, into sharp focus. So there's efficiency that's subsidized and changes people's behavior to crops, I believe can be fraught with danger down the track if it's not thought through.
I see Anne's come online there. Anne, I hope that answered your question okay.
Yes, partly. I had a second question that was related to the almonds, though. They're creating a new issue in that the water's being traded around the basin, the expectations raised that water can go anywhere. And I've just heard a discussion this week saying the movement of the water has been separated from the ability of the system to deliver the water. And we're looking at a crisis where all these almonds are going to need water in late summer in places where the water can't be delivered to them.
No, it's another good point, and I saw that as well. I'm not sure about that, to be honest. Where I saw them going in was certainly what I would say not connected to the river. So not far from the river, but I suspect not directly connected. But at the end of the day, if the farmer has made the decision to do that, I'm assuming they've made it with enough knowledge to get their supply as needed. But as you say, when the network when the cropping pattern has transformed so dramatically that now we have a massive requirement in one spot that didn't exist before, particularly for perennials like almonds, as you say. Yes, it's going to be interesting. I would like to think that there's some planning behind that, but yeah.
Unfortunately, they're downstream of the Barmer Choke, and they're also downstream of Menindee Lakes. Menindee Lakes is taken offline. It's going to be a real problem.
Yes, you're absolutely right. Goes back to this idea of the requirement for cooperation and collaboration, and keeping everybody part of that process for sharing the water. So you're right. If New South Wales, as it's threatening to do, pulls the pin on the basin plan and other things, and the joint partner agreements as we have here to move water through the system, yes.
There's some good challenges for governance in the future, and I'm sure they'll continue. Thanks, Anne, for those questions. They're terrific. I will have to move on, I'm afraid, but please stay online.
Thank you, Adam.
Thanks, Anne.
I've got a few questions here, really about sort of, in a sense, greenfield sort of questions. So we've learned a lot from things in the past, the Murray-Darling Basin. So there's Paul talks about the Northern Basin Review, where they didn't deal with true bottom line outcomes for Paul, but they didn't get up politically. And then Simon says that there's no charging forward in the Northern Territory. So where do you start? What's a good model for that place where you haven't got that process in place just yet? So I'll put those two questions together.
Yes, too good. Yeah, the Northern Basin Review, I think that's the work that was done by the authority, I think, was reasonable. To my mind, the questions are tricky ones to answer. How do you really get at economic or social impacts from something as complicated as a plan? And so I'm not able to answer that question. I think a lot of people have struggled to find the science to support those, and therefore, and some of those I think are what I call into question. There was one also done in the South recently, which I have no faith in whatsoever. But it's easy for me to say that. So is there a good model for charging? No, I don't believe so. Not yet. I don't even think we've got that right in Australia. And the reason why I say that is because we haven't got, even after all this time and COAG objectives and requirements for full cost recovery pricing, we still haven't achieved it. Why? Because if in some areas we were to fully cost and charge what we were spending to deliver water, it would be uneconomic. Farmers would not be able to pay it, and that would be the end of them. So no is the short answer. For markets, the Murray-Darling Basin is a fabulous example, world's best practice, no doubt. Data could be better, always, and barriers could be still reduced. But frankly, there's fewer and fewer things to deal with in some respect with the markets, which is great. But for charging, I'm not aware of any models that work brilliantly. No.
Thanks, Adam. I might go back to Paul's issue about city versus country, where he talks about, says, would it be more efficient to buy back water that is exported from Adelaide for agriculture than to buy back water from the Murray-Darling Basin irrigators to secure Adelaide's water supply?
So would it be cheaper to buy back water that's exported for us as a city,
yes,
rather than getting it from irrigators? Well, technically it's the same water. Yeah. Arguably, it's taken off at the Mannum pipeline from Murray Water. It's brought here, processed, and then used as potable supply, that up to 200 gigalitres in any 1 year for Adelaide. Yes, we could reduce our reliance on the Murray and say we will take, for example, 150 rather than 200, and we could up our desalination plant, which has the capacity to effectively make up the difference and is operating at reduced capacity right now because we're in arguably normal conditions. Yes, we could do that. It would cost, obviously, the people of Adelaide an increased tariff, which they may or may not be willing to pay. So the real question is the differential for that more or less than what it would cost us to buy back the water? And the simple answer is yes, it's a great difference. In terms of the desal would cost us more to buy essentially purified water off the sea than it would to go and get raw water from the Murray-Darling Basin. So no, it wouldn't be cheaper. Again, though, I come back to my point, which is that it may be cheaper, but it doesn't necessarily achieve a fait accompli, because an irrigator or whoever's got the water has got to agree. And if they don't, then it doesn't get done.
In the meantime, I've got another question for you, Adam, from an anonymous person who says, do you think that resulting inquiries and ICAC investigations will make a difference to maintaining good governance? Or is the Water Act, Intergovernmental Agreement, Basin Plan under real threat? After all, enforcement is expensive and politically unpalatable. So are we going to get through this, I think is the question.
Yeah, we will. I've no doubt in my mind we will. The environment is incredibly important. No matter what side of the fence you sit on, the environment underpins everything we do, domestically, economically, recreationally, indigenously, if that's a word. So we value it, and we've spent an awful lot of money to recover water for the environment. Now, it's a shame, it really is, that a couple of people have tested the system, but I'm buoyed by the fact that at the end of the day, we discovered that fault and we've tried to address it. My view on Ken Matthews' findings and recommendations are that they were beautifully written, very strong, very clear. So it now sits with the New South Wales government and any other government who is reviewing their arrangements in these compliance areas to step forward and do what is required to follow those recommendations and to get us back on track. I don't believe personally that it will fall apart. The stakes are too high. But again, the original question that was asked, politics is important for this process. Absolutely it is. It's critical. And it can increase the costs, increase the time, increase the pressure, and increase, critically for all of us, the uncertainty. And that is the greatest cost of all. And that's what we're facing here. I think we'll be okay, though.
All right. Look, thanks, Adam. I think we're just about right out of time. I think I've still got a couple of other questions, but I do need to wrap up. There's just one last question from Kazuya, who asked for some references for some of the materials and the thinking about policies in the future. So perhaps if we can ask you to add some of those references to some of your slides, and I'm sure that will be helpful. So again, to all of you, thank you for participating, and you'll get a link for the recording for this webinar. Keep an eye on our website and of the newsletters you receive to hear about future webinars in the future. Once again, Adam, thank you for presenting, and to you all, thanks for enjoying the presentation, and see you next time, and have a good Easter break. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Ian. Thank you all.